Does mass equal gas? Well, kind of. We're going to talk about some of the arguments for and against this idea of does mass equal gas in this video, and we're going to tie it all together and explain what you can do about it in your own pitching career. But first, I'm Ben Brewster, co-founder of Untitled Athletics. We train thousands of high school, college, and professional baseball pitchers. Let's dive in. It might seem counterintuitive, but this whole idea of mass equals gas was not always the case. 50 years ago, lifting weights was seen as potentially dangerous. Certain pitchers that lifted weights were really counter to the narrative at the time, which was a lot more based on distance running, a lot more based around this idea that lifting weights would make you bulky, lifting weights was potentially injurious. And so you can think back to pitchers like Tom Seaver, Hall of Fame pitcher Nolan Ryan, these guys who were very religious about their weightlifting routines, but they were, again, kind of seen as against the grain at that point in time, despite seeing how well it helped them in their own careers and with their own ability to throw very, very hard for their respective generations. And so you can see, if you look at this progression of pitcher body weights in the MLB by year, that there really was a steady trend up over time as baseball just continued to get more competitive. But there was something that happened. There was an inflection point in the early to mid 1990s. And so we look at around 1994, that average MLB pitcher body weight was about 193 pounds. You fast forward to 2010 and that number had skyrocketed to about 217 pounds. Now it's stabilized a little bit since then. So from about 2010, pitchers have roughly stabilized between about 6'2", 6'3", and 210 to 215 pounds. So where they are today in 2024, about 6'3" and 211 pounds. But from this point in time, over about a decade and a half, the average pitcher body weight rose by about 24 pounds. This also corresponded to a rise in average velocity from just under 90 miles an hour almost 94 miles an hour where it is today. So there are a ton of factors that likely led to this rise in weight training, this rise in hunting for additional mass as a pitcher to shoot for more velocity. But I think a couple of things worth mentioning are, one, the radar guns just became a lot more widespread, a lot more accessible, and everyone just started to chase velocity. And so it's no surprise then that weight training, that seeking mass began to become more widespread at that point in time as well. After the steroid era, it just became undeniable too that increased strength, increased size was associated with performance enhancement. And so again, pitchers began to try to hunt for how can I throw harder by using weight training, getting bigger, stronger, faster, just to give myself a leg up and an advantage. And so this is where my career came in. Around 2007, I was 15 years old. I was just starting to get really serious about my own training. And so I was very much in this mindset of mass equals gas. Can I just get as big and strong as humanly possible and see what happens, and see if I can also do what these guys on TV are doing, see if I can throw 95 miles an hour and potentially play in college, potentially play professionally. And I was starting from a point at 6'3", 150 to 155 pounds, and I was throwing 70 to 73 miles an hour. And so the thing is, I had no idea what I was doing. It took me, 5 years to go from 150 to 220 pounds. Over that time, I did go from low 70s to 88 to 92, touching 93. So I did gain about 20 miles an hour over gaining those 70 pounds. But it took me 5 years, and knowing what I know now, knowing what we know that we can help players with, it should have taken me about 2.5 years to gain that size, to gain that initial velocity. But the point is that over this entire progression, if you look at this progression here of me going from that low 70s to ultimately 98 plus miles an hour, there was a very strong correlation between mass and between my velocity to a point. At that point, it started to produce diminishing returns. And so although I did get MLB strong, I had built the mass. At that point in time, sophomore year of college, I still wasn't throwing as hard as I needed to be throwing. And I still didn't have the MLB velocity to go with it. It's not as simple as just mass equals gas. There's so many other variables that go into squeezing out that last little bit of performance, as important as mass is in that initial phase in the training process. So there's a number of studies that show a strong correlation between body mass and between velocity. But within that, some of the variables that you have to consider is that bigger pitchers tend to also be taller, they tend to also have longer levers, and they tend to also be stronger. So there's a number of different variables that kind of go into that number being so correlated to velocity. Also, if you look at some of the research here, there's a huge increase in mass if you go from high school pitchers to college pitchers to even rookie ball, low A, double A, triple A, big league pitchers. So that increase in mass is correlated across levels. No surprise here, college pitchers are bigger, stronger, faster than high school pitchers. MLB pitchers are bigger, stronger, faster than high school or college pitchers. But even within the MLB, which again, you would expect a little bit of a survivorship bias here, even in the MLB, where some of these outliers have managed to make it to the top, there still is a positive, if not a weaker, but still a positive correlation between body weight overall and velocity. So in general, pitchers that are throwing the hardest in the big leagues are also bigger, faster, stronger than the pitchers that are throwing towards the lower end of the velocity spectrum. All this being said, shouldn't mass equal gas? Well, the problem is that there's plenty of outliers, and we can all think of them, the Tim Lincecums, the Chris Sales, the Tristan McKenzie's. There's so many guys that showcase that it's possible to throw hard without necessarily being 6'4", 230 pounds. And so we've helped a ton of guys gain 50 pounds, 60 pounds, 70 pounds, gain 10 miles an hour, and mass and strength have been a huge piece of that component. But by that same token, we've also helped players drop 20, 30, 40, 50 pounds and also gain 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 miles an hour. There's no one size fits all. mass can be strongly correlated, but then there's also times when we actually need to reduce a player's mass and they can actually end up throwing harder. So what's exactly going on there? Here's why increased mass doesn't necessarily help everyone, because as most of you watching this video know, it's actually about the quality of the mass. So is that lean mass? Is this actual skeletal muscle mass? Is this muscle tissue? Or is this fat mass? And the issue with just gaining fat is that fat doesn't contract. Fat doesn't actually help you move faster down the mound. It doesn't actually help you accelerate the ball faster. And in most cases, getting fat actually just slows you down. And so it kind of defeats the whole purpose of gaining mass. So what are we actually trying to do? We're trying to gain quality mass. Muscle can contract, fat doesn't contract. So I can think back to one example from my own college playing career where I had a teammate who he was about 6'7", throwing mid upper 80s, and he was really trying to take this to heart and figure out how to throw harder. And so he was thinking that, okay, mass equals gas. He went off for winter break. He comes back 6 to 8 weeks later. He's 25, 30 pounds heavier. He really had just gotten fat. He was eating candy, Chick-fil-A. He was eating whatever type of food he needed to do to gain that weight. He gained it way too aggressively, which we tell our guys all the time, like you need to be in a slight caloric surplus, not a massive caloric surplus where all that weight is going to just be going straight towards fat gain. And so he came back, he was 30 pounds heavier. In his mind, he'd accomplished the goal. In his mind, he should be throwing 93 miles an hour. He'd accomplished the goal, but he came back, he was throwing the exact same velocity, if not slightly slower. And you could just tell in the quality of his movement, he was moving so much slower. His arm was so much slower. He was rotating so much slower. So again, just comes back to what we all know, but it's the quality of the mass that matters. 2 players gain 20 pounds. One of them does it over a 6-month offseason, doubles all their strength lifts, their strength numbers. One player gains 20 pounds in a month, and they just end up adding body fat. Like, which player is actually going to get the performance enhancement effect of that weight gain? Obviously the lean mass, because that's translating to actually being able to accelerate the baseball and move athletically down the mound. So we go back to the study, which was comparing high school, college, and professional pitchers, and we look at the amount of lean body mass and the amount of peak power. You can actually see that there's an almost direct correlation between an increase in lean mass and an increase in peak power. And again, not surprising. If it was as simple as just getting bigger and throwing harder, then we'd all be able to put weight vests on our bodies. We'd be able to put a 20-pound weight vest on and immediately throw harder. Of course, it doesn't work that way. If our mass gets too high, our ability to actually rotate quickly and move athletically starts to diminish, and we end up throwing slower. So for me, the way I rephrase this is that it's not mass equals gas, it's lean mass equals potential gas. And so that's how I would rephrase this. If you're a coach, if you're a player, and someone comes to you and says, hey, does mass equal gas? Well, yes, lean mass is potential gas. Let's talk about that a little bit more. So bear with me, we're gonna talk through some of the physics of this. And I think this will make a lot more sense as to how you can have guys that are big throwing hard, how you can also have guys like Chris Sale who are 160 pounds, also throwing 100 miles an hour. So there's a few different ways to think of this from a physics standpoint, but we're gonna use kinetic energy for the sake of this video. So the way you can think of it is higher kinetic energy would be higher velocity. So we're trying to transfer kinetic energy to the baseball. And so higher kinetic energy would be higher velocity. You don't need to worry too much about this equation. Just know that the variables that go into kinetic energy would be mass and velocity. And within velocity, what composes velocity? There's a displacement piece. We want high displacement, and there's time. We want low time. So what would that look like? That would look like somebody with a lot of mass. High displacement would be the distance over which we can apply force to the baseball and accelerate the baseball. So high displacement would be the guy who's got deep retraction, lots of hip shoulder separation, and is able to accelerate the ball over that very long range of motion, versus a guy with short displacement. They'd land, they'd already be open with their torso, their arm would be here, they wouldn't really get any layback, and they'd only apply force to the ball from here to here. And so their displacement would look like that, versus Ben Joyce's displacement would look like that. It's just a lot longer distance to be able to apply that force to the back of the baseball to build kinetic energy. And the time piece is how fast can we do that? How fast can we close that gap from the point at which we start accelerating the baseball? Ben Joyce getting into deep ranges doesn't really matter if he does it super slow and not explosively. And so again, there's kind of different components to this. There's being fast twitch, there's having long levers or getting into deep positions in your mechanics, and then there's also the mass component. And so the idea here is that there's trade-offs. It's not just about maximizing the math piece of the equation, because if you get too big or it reduces your ability to actually apply that force fast, or reduces your mobility, now that can actually result in less kinetic energy and lower ball velocity. And so I think through how you might be able to categorize pitchers from a physics standpoint. You're gonna have your mass guys like Brusdar Graterol, 260, 270 pounds, whatever he is, not necessarily getting in crazy deep positions, right? Mechanics aren't particularly special, but he's really optimizing the mass side of the equation. You're gonna have pitchers that are optimizing the displacement side of the equation, either with levers or with deep positions of their mechanics. So it might be a Randy Johnson who just has a 6'10" wingspan, and so his displacement super high in that equation. Or you might only be a 6'3" pitcher or a 6-foot pitcher, and so you're having to rely more on scap retraction, hip shoulder separation, and layback to maximize displacement. That would be your Aroldis Chapman's, that would be your Ben Joyce's, guys that get into deep positions in their deliveries. And then you're going to have the guys who are the fast twitch, the explosive, the reactive, the elastic type pitchers, like a Shohei Ohtani, like a Tristan McKenzie, like a Chris Sale. Again, not necessarily getting into deep positions in their mechanics, not necessarily the biggest guys out there, but they're ultra fast switch. And so they're minimizing the time component. They're just super explosive. They can close that gap. They can rotate in that very tight window very explosively. So just different ways to think through this equation and think through how you can still create a ton of velocity and a ton of kinetic energy from a physics standpoint. And so from tread standpoint, this is how we try to approach velocity development. Can we increase lean body mass? Can we improve that variable? Can we also help guys reduce the time component, be more explosive? Can we also help guys improve the displacement component, get into better positions in their delivery? And then can we also improve the overall sequencing and how athletically they move and sequence everything through their body, approaching this equation from let's try to improve every variable that we have control over to improve ball velocity, not even factoring in the overall goal, which is performance, command, pitch design, all these other variables that go into the equation as well. And then one side note is that for shorter pitchers, the pitchers that we've worked with who have been under 5'10" and thrown 95, 96 plus miles an hour, and there have been a handful of them, those guys tend to have to optimize really every part of this equation because they don't have levers on their side. So if you think to like Marcus Stroman in college throwing 100 miles an hour, fairly jacked, like 180 pounds, 185 pounds, he's ultra explosive, his mechanics are damn near perfect, he's getting into deep positions in his delivery as far as torso, arm, layback. So he's maximizing the displacement to the point that he possibly can with his lever lengths. And then he's optimized his lean body mass to the extent that he possibly can. So if you're a shorter pitcher out there, just know like it is more of an uphill battle, but you can still produce a ton of kinetic energy if you optimize these other variables in the equation. So we've talked a lot about lean body mass here, but one way that can still come back to bite you in some cases is the example of the high school pitcher training with his high school football coach, doing a ton of bench press. If his pec gets tight, if the arm can no longer get into good positions, and a pitcher who maybe was throwing 80 miles an hour but weak, was getting in good positions and had a high displacement, that pitcher gains lean body mass, he gets the mass up, he gets explosive, he gets strong, a ton of bench press, but he ends up losing mobility. Well, now that pitcher's displacement has been negatively altered. And so now his ability to apply force over that long range of motion has been altered. And so again, even lean body mass is still only potential gas. It's not guaranteed gas. As you get stronger, there's a chance for certain players that the mobility is negatively impacted as well. Can we improve that lean mass while, if at all possible, maintaining or even improving mobility? And so that's the goal here with our guys at Tread, is not just improving lean mass in isolation, but improving these other variables alongside it. So again, getting big and strong isn't enough in isolation. We get emails all the time from people who reach out and they've gotten to a 1.5 times body weight reverse lunge. They've gotten to a 2 times body weight squat. They're bench pressing 250 pounds. Like, they've gotten big, they've gotten strong for their frames, and they're still throwing 83, 84, 86, whatever the number is. And so just recognizing like that in isolation isn't enough. That's going to get you to a certain point, but now something else becomes your limiting factor, whether it's your mobility, whether it's your mechanical efficiency, whether it's explosiveness in your power output, whether it's something else. If I can think to one of our former athletes, now a current coach with us, Matt Marcelli, he was squatting 600 pounds in college. He was bench pressing, 315 pounds. He was as strong as you're going to get. He's stronger than almost every big league pitcher. He's throwing 88 to 92. And so for him, what got him to 93 to 96, touching 97 plus miles an hour, was the power output. It was the mobility side. It was improving his mechanical efficiency. It was all the other pieces of the puzzle that the focus needed to shift to in his training. And so it was the same thing for me, as I've already said. What got me to touching 93 is not what got me to 98 miles an hour. And so again, if you're watching this, you might have had a ton of success getting that first 5 or 10 or 15 miles an hour from strength training. But what got you to 85, what got you to 90 miles an hour is not what's going to get you to 90 or 95 miles an hour. You're squatting 400 pounds, you don't need to be shooting to squat 500 pounds. If you're deadlifting 500 pounds, you don't need to be deadlifting 600 pounds. There's a huge point of diminishing returns, and just understanding that what got you to where you are right now at a certain point will level off, and it becomes about these other more fine-tuned variables to be able to squeeze out that last little bit of performance. Let's go over some takeaways for this video. And the first is, how big and strong should you get? And I tell guys that you should be getting MLB big and MLB strong. So what does that mean? How big are MLB players? Well, you can take a look at this table, and it gives you a general range for each height, gives you body weights for each height. So you can look through this table at 6'3". That range is about 200 to 225 pounds, with that average being right around 215 pounds. And so this gives you at least something to shoot for, especially if you're earlier on in your training career. For me at 155 pounds, this would have been very, very valuable because I would have actually known something realistic to shoot for. So MLB big, this is going to be a fairly large range. So this is about a 40-pound window, plus or minus 20 pounds from that average. It at least gives you something to shoot for. Typically, guys who are a little bit more thinner, narrower frames, they're not going to be able to get to that top end of this 40-pound range. You're going to be shooting more so for the middle or that like lower part of this range. And guys who are naturally very wide frames, mesomorph type bodies, they're going to be more towards the middle to upper end of the range. Higher body fats, guys at the lower end of this range are going to be typically a little bit leaner, but this gives you a general framework to be able to shoot for. There's something called the fat free mass index. So I'll link a calculator that you guys can go to, and essentially you can put your numbers in there and it'll give you an idea of, in a perfect world, this is how much lean body mass your frame could potentially hold. Put in your height, put in your weight, put in your current body fat percentage, and it gives you just something realistic to shoot for as far as what your frame could potentially hold. As far as how strong should you get, this is going to be very individual, again, based on height, based on lever lengths, based on tendon attachments, based on a ton of variables in your own genetics. But typically the point at which we see MLB players get, where getting stronger than that point doesn't tend to have a ton of transfer to velocity. That point is something around a mid 300s squat for reps. I'm talking about true parallel squat for 5 to 6 reps, mid 300s. For a deadlift, something like a low 400s deadlift for reps. For a straight bar, mid 400s deadlift for reps for a trap bar deadlift. And then from dumbbell bench press or dumbbell row, something like 95 to 100 pound dumbbells for working sets. For clean reps, full range of motion, 5 or 6 reps. Very strong, but not absurdly strong. There are certainly guys who are substantially stronger than that and who still throw hard, but there's so many guys that are right around these numbers that still throw very, very hard. And so it becomes much more about the mobility, the mechanics, the other pieces of the puzzle at that point, where we start to see diminishing returns and we shift the focus to movement quality, to power output, and to these other variables. So you've got an MLB strong, you've got an MLB big. Now, what do you need to do from a body fat percentage? And what we tell guys is get MLB lean. What is MLB lean? Well, essentially it's within about that 10 to 20% body fat window. Within that range, you're just gonna have to experiment over time to figure out where you feel, recover, and perform the best. There's gonna be a little bit of trial and error, a little bit of a discovery process here once you've built some of these strength numbers, once you're roughly in that general 40-pound window of body weight. So for me, like as I was already going through, I got to 220 pounds and to some of these strength numbers by sophomore year of college. But over time, I started to figure out, okay, I don't quite like how I'm recovering and feeling and moving at 220 pounds. And I've kind of realized over time, like I tend to do better right around 205 to 210, right around, 12% body fat versus like 18% body fat at 220 or 10% body fat at 195. For me, that was the sweet spot. So I tell guys there needs to be a certain trial and error and discovery process to figure out the amount of leanness that you feel, recover, and perform the best. And so again, over time, you'll figure out where you need to be within that 10 to 20% window. It's what I would consider athletically lean, where you can still move very well down the mound. Getting shredded beyond that point typically isn't additionally helpful, but getting much fatter than that 20% range, we typically see performance decreases and velocity decrease after a certain point. We do regular in-house body fat testing with the InBody, and so that's something that we make sure we monitor with our guys when they visit in-house. So hopefully this helped to clarify the idea of does mass equal gas. In summary, lean mass equals potential gas. There's a lot more variables that go into the equation that you need to be aware of. Mechanics still matter, mobility still matters. And if you get excessively high body fat or you start to reduce mobility as you gain mass, it can actually do more harm than good. We really try to take a global approach to player development and not just look at it from one lens. We still need to be aware that on-field performance is the most important thing. We can't forget about the pitch design standpoint. We can't forget about designing our arsenal and the data and the usage side of it, the command side of it. We can't forget about the mental training side of it. All these different pieces come together ultimately to optimize in-game performance, which is what matters at the end of the day. If you guys are still looking for more resources, we have a free weight gain program on our website you guys can check out. We also have a metric analysis tool you can check out where you can plug all your metrics in and it'll be able to give you a percentile based on your level of where you stack up. And then finally, if you guys are still looking for more guidance, you want to share your story with our team, hop on a call with our team and learn a little bit more about what we do with our players, check out with the link down below. We're happy to talk to you and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.